Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe keeps rates on hold in his last meeting on the job. Qantas CEO Alan Joyce has pressed the eject button and is leaving the airline early. And China is no longer expected to overtake the US as the world's biggest economy. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Wednesday, the 6th of September, 2023. I'm Michael Thompson and Sean Aylmer is still away, so I'm joined instead by Jennifer Duke. Jen, good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
Now, your interview today is a fantastic one because, look, I'm not going to be harsh or anything, but technology and some of these kind of stories about kind of tech innovation, I'm learning through you in this because it feels like you are learning a lot. And Zach Duff today, the co-founder and CEO of Jigspace, is someone who taught you quite a bit.
That's right. And I didn't know what a jig was until I was speaking with Zach. But basically, he's creating 3D virtual models for the metaverse, which is a sentence I never thought I would say. And it's actually been used by Apple as part of a demo for its Vision Pro headset. So Zach was telling me all about how he thinks the tech might be used in future, including by consumers, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, it is really cool. And the fact is that, as you mentioned, it was used by Apple as part of that very, very high-profile demonstration of the Vision Pro headsets. And so that was seen by tens of millions of people around the world, which is pretty amazing for a little Aussie business. And so it is a great chat. And like you, I wasn't aware of what a jig was. So you asking him what a jig was taught us all, Jen. So it's a good chat. It's worth sticking around for. It's coming up a little bit later on. But the main story this morning, the Reserve Bank has kept rates on hold but flagged concerns about the outlook for inflation and left the door open to future hikes.
Yeah, so this is Governor Philip Lowe's final interest rate decision, and he left it at 4.1%. So I'd imagine there's plenty of mortgage holders listening that will be breathing a sigh of relief at the moment. They've faced rises to the tune of about 4 percentage points since May last year, and the RBA knows that, and that's part of the reason that we're on hold, so that they can see whether those increases that they've put through will do the trick in terms of bringing that inflation down. This is the third month the rates have been on hold, and the RBA specifically said that inflation has finally passed its peak in Australia, with the monthly inflation data for July showing another decline. So that's all pretty good news.
It is good news. It's very good news. But is it the end of this particular cycle, this particular rate rising cycle?
Oh, that's the really, really big question, and we're all thinking about it. The RBA kept the same wording as last month on this issue, so they said that there's some further tightening that might be needed to get inflation down, but ultimately it depends on the data and the changing risks.
So this is obviously something that you're keeping a very close eye on as the economics correspondent for Capital Brief. There are some serious uncertainties to the outlook right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of these is actually the impact on Australia that might occur as a result of China's economy and the stress in the property market over there, which we've been speaking about quite a bit. So China is obviously our major trading partner, and the economy affects ours significantly. It's not really clear either how businesses are going to respond to slower economic growth in terms of pricing and wages locally. And we don't fully know yet how people are changing their spending, because obviously there's some households that are doing it tough with higher mortgages, but others have loads of savings and are benefiting from the higher interest rates and rising house prices.
That sounds like a lot of unknowns, Jen.
Yeah, it is. And it's at a time when trust between the public and central banks is pretty low. So earlier this week, European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde gave a speech in London, and she was raising concerns about how to communicate with the public in today's era of new tech and fake news. And this is critical because part of the effectiveness of monetary policy is actually jawboning and managing those public expectations around inflation. And we all know from experience in Australia what happens when you get your forecasts wrong. So one thing that will become a bit clearer today is how rate rises hit the economy over the June quarter, and we'll get the full GDP picture this afternoon.
Yeah, and we'll have all of that information in this afternoon's afternoon report. How did local markets perform yesterday?
So the S&P ASX 200 closed down 0.1% to 7,314 points after a pretty mixed trading day. Utilities and energy were the worst performing sectors over the day. Healthcare and consumer staples held up best. In terms of companies, the best performer was healthcare giant Imugene, up 3.1%. IGO was up 2.4%, and the worst performer was again Chalice Mining, down 13.4%.
And what's going on international markets?
So, global economic growth is actually expected to slow in 2024. Consensus Economics has combined several forecasts to estimate a slowing in global economic output to 2.1% next year. Now, that's down from the 2.4% we're expecting this year. Some of this is due to better growth than previously expected in 2023, and that makes 24 look worse than it might otherwise, but there's still a slight souring in the outlook. China's services sector is growing at the slowest rate this year so far. August data from Caixin and S&P Global suggests less new work, a fall in business from abroad, and overall a weaker than expected recovery. And Barclays is warning sovereign bond investors not to misprice the risk of countries failing to protect natural capital. So that's water, air, soil, those sorts of things. Bloomberg reports that markets like Bangladesh and Ethiopia already have junk ratings, while those with low investment grade ratings like the Philippines, Indonesia, and India are also a concern.
That's an interesting story.
Yeah, it is actually.
It's something that I don't think I've given much thought to at all, but I imagine it's something that we're going to be hearing a lot more about.
Yeah, I think that the value of natural capital in Australia, there's been quite a few reports on this actually, and whether or not investors see that value properly, whether they're measuring it, if it is actually properly measurable, economists would say that it is, and then how much of a risk that actually is to the overall price of something. Like it's quite confusing, but it's I think it's going to be a really big issue over the next few years.
Yeah, certainly will be. All right, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Jen, Qantas CEO Alan Joyce will retire 2 months early as the scandals engulfing the airline just continue to grow.
Yeah, so Qantas announced yesterday that Joyce will step down sooner than originally planned to help with renewal at the airline. So Vanessa Hudson will be CEO from today. Joyce described it as the best thing he could do under the circumstances, which have been pretty grim. And he said there was a lot that he was actually proud of from his last 22 years at the carrier, of which 15 were spent as CEO. But he acknowledged there have been some ups and some downs. I would assume that the last few weeks are very much in the down category.
I think that's a fairly safe assumption, that one.
Chairman Richard Goyder said that Joyce had always had the best interests of Qantas front and centre, and his decision to step down demonstrated that. Goyder said he wouldn't be stepping down himself, and shareholders will vote on Hudson as a replacement at the AGM in November.
Jen, Westpac is facing legal action from the corporate regulator over allegations it failed to respond to hundreds of customers facing difficulties repaying their loans.
So more than 200 customers had told Westpac that they were struggling with issues affecting their ability to make repayments, and they were actually asking Westpac to enter hardship arrangements with them. But the bank failed to respond, and that's according to ASIC. This relates to customer issues from 2015 to 2022. Now, there was a problem with the online hardship notice process, which meant that customers weren't getting a response within the required timeframe, which is 21 days. So customers are protected by the National Credit Code, and that sets out these sorts of timeframes.
So what is ASIC alleging here then?
Yeah, ASIC is saying that Westpac didn't act efficiently, honestly, or fairly, I think is how they described it, by failing to respond. Westpac has apologised, and they actually self-reported this issue to the regulator. They're not making excuses for it. They're saying they helped out some of the customers after the time frame, but that clearly wasn't good enough. Westpac did receive about 630,000 hardship requests over the period in question, but just one borrower not getting the help that they need is one far too many.
Yeah, indeed. Now, the ATO is warning the nation's 2 million landlords to make sure they aren't making dodgy deductions, with property investors' tax refunds going up while most people's returns are actually shrinking.
Yeah, there are some very valid reasons why landlords would be claiming more deductions this tax time, firstly. So interest rates, obviously, on investment property loans and all loans have gone up. The cost of repairs and improvements has risen because everything's going up in price. Insurance premiums are higher and other expenses have been climbing. So valid reasons. Costs are, though, apparently still climbing faster than rents. Regardless, the ATO is concerned about property investors getting their returns wrong, particularly when claiming a deduction on the interest of their investment loan. So apparently, some landlords are refinancing an investment property and then using a portion of that loan to cover their own personal expenses. And you obviously can't claim that.
Now, this is an interesting one, Jen. Melbourne-based glass bottle and can maker Aurora is putting $2.16 billion on the line to buy a French business called Saverglass from a US private equity group.
That's right, Michael. So Aurora's raising $1.34 billion to help pay for the purchase of the business. Saberglass is actually a major producer of top-end spirit bottles. You might not have heard of Saberglass, but you would have heard of Grey Goose, Hennessy and Glenfiddich. And the majority of its revenue comes from these sorts of specialist glass bottles. Now, it actually has 6 factories across France, the United Arab Emirates, Mexico and Belgium. And cost of living pressures have raised some concerns about the ongoing demand for alcohol. But Aurora CEO Brian Lowe said that they don't see the volatility that other discretionary spending areas have been facing as they operate in that top end of spirits and wine category. Interestingly, this is actually similar to what Treasury Wine Estates said during earnings season, and we talked about this, that budget booze drinkers are pulling back on spending, but the luxury brands like Penfolds are holding really strong.
Yeah, that is an interesting trend. Now, Chevron's 2 major LNG plants in WA will start to feel the brunt of worker strikes from tomorrow, with the action now due to escalate next week.
So the strikes are kicking in from 6 a.m. tomorrow and will initially be about 10 hours a day. But the Offshore Alliance has just notified Chevron that these strikes are just the beginning. They'll be stepping it up to rolling 24-hour stoppages from September 14, and this will continue for a fortnight at the Gorgon and Wheatstone facilities. Those 2 facilities are the source of 7% of the world's LNG supply and about half of WA's domestic gas. So it is a potentially huge disruption that's going to come. Now, the new action will include a ban on maintenance work as well.
Bankers may soon have their bonuses linked to climate targets. Jen, NAB chairman Phil Cronican has put the idea on the table for his executives.
This is actually becoming a trend. So in Britain with NatWest and Barclays, they're linking long-term bonuses to climate goals at their banks. And Cronican says he's attracted to the idea and open to doing the same at NAB. But that is provided that reasonable measurements can be found for this. So he isn't convinced that the current methods to track this are mature or stable enough yet. But clearly, when the metrics develop, he thinks it makes sense. And this would most likely be in the long-term incentive category. So Bendigo and Adelaide Bank already ring-fence about 10% of their long-term bonuses to people and the planet. And environmental, social and governance metrics are pretty commonly used now as part of executive pay. But shareholders want these measures to be really, really clear.
The crucial Eraring power station may be kept open past 2025, with the New South Wales government starting discussions with Origin Energy on a deal.
So this particular coal-fired power station supplies 25% of New South Wales's energy needs. And the state's Energy Minister, Penny Sharp, yesterday published the findings of a checkup on the energy supply. And it was a worry. It found that continuing with the existing closure timeline would present significant reliability and affordability risks. So switching over to renewables is underway, but it's taking longer than expected. And broadly, that means that there's a risk of blackouts and soaring prices if existing sources of power are turned off too early. But an extension with Origin will come at a cost to the government. Interestingly, this news broke at the same time as a story showing that no wind farms have actually been granted approval for the past 28 months in New South Wales. So it's pretty clear what the problems are.
Okay, one last one, Jen, before we get to international news. More than $60 million has been stolen from cryptocurrency casino stake.com by cyber criminals. Now, just to be super clear, this is not the stake that we've talked about on Fear and Greed before. There's a financial services company, a share trading platform really called Stake. This is not that particular company.
Yeah, it's definitely not that particular one. For those who haven't heard of this particular stake, it's a gambling website that uses crypto. And Aussies can't actually access it because of laws here that ban online casinos. But it's actually operated out of Melbourne by one of Australia's youngest self-made billionaires, Ed Craven, who is a co-founder. Now, there was a pretty serious cyber attack on Stake. Thankfully, they're saying that user funds are safe and no customers suffered a loss as a result, which is great. But Ethereum withdrawals were temporarily down. And the AFR reports that the funds were stolen from one of the company's hot wallets, which is where the company digitally stores crypto to kind of pay out customers. They're talking to authorities about the attack at the moment.
A hot wallet? I've never heard that term before.
That is what it's called.
Oh, there we go. Gosh, I learned some stuff on this show.
It sounds like a stolen purse, doesn't it?
A stolen purse. Yes, it does. And now we need to clarify that we are not talking about a stolen purse. Now, in international news, Jen, we mentioned this one at the top of the show, and I'm actually quite surprised by this. After years of forecasts that China will take over from the US as the world's biggest economy, that may no longer be the case. Now, Bloomberg Economics has released new predictions saying that it will now take until the mid-2040s for China's GDP to overtake the US.
And that will only be temporary before it falls back behind. And that's because China is downshifting onto a slower growth path than previously expected. And the post-COVID recovery has already run out of steam, unfortunately. So that's compounded by the property slump and declining confidence. And China's economy expanded by 3% in 2022. And that was actually one of the slowest rates of growth in decades.
And of course, that it's not helping the relationship between China and the US, which continues to, I suppose it's still kind of crumbling, isn't it? It's certainly not making any improvements. You have China's spy agency criticized the US for using a few, quote, beautiful words while still bad-mouthing Beijing and causing trouble in the South China Sea.
Yeah, it was a rare and pretty intense statement issued by China's Ministry of State Security, and it was over WeChat and reported by the Financial Times. So the comments said that US officials had been visiting China one after another and saying the Biden administration had no intent to curb China's development or seek decoupling. But it said that China saw this approach as, quote, old wine in new bottles, which is a great phrase, and it would not relax its vigilance. So this follows confirmation that Xi Jinping will not be attending the G20 summit in New Delhi over the weekend, which is a big snub. And US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo recently visited China, and while she was warm on the progress of the meetings, she also said that businesses were increasingly avoiding investments in the world's second biggest economy.
Old wine in new bottles, hot wallets. Gosh, I'm putting together a list of fun things I've learnt about today. Now, Elon Musk's Twitter or X troubles continue. It's going to take a long time for me to adjust to calling it X. Ad sales are down 60% on the rebranded social media service, and Musk says it's, quote, primarily due to pressure on advertisers.
So Musk reckons it's the Anti-Defamation League that's behind the ad revenue slump that they're experiencing. And he was tweeting that advertisers have told him this directly. He says the ADL is falsely accusing X and him of being anti-Semitic. And he went so far as to hint at possible legal action if the group continues. Musk says he is pro-free speech, but also against any kind of anti-Semitism. The league claims harassment and extremism have increased on X since Musk bought it.
All right, there has been a lot of news to get through today. Up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview. You're speaking with Zach Duff, the co-founder and CEO of Jigspace.
Yeah, and I'm assuming there's lots of people on here who kind of want to know what a jig is now, so they should probably listen to find out.
It is a great story. It is well worth a listen. It's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. And don't forget as well to check out the new episode of How Do They Afford That, our sister podcast that comes out every Wednesday, all about making your money work a little bit harder for you. Today's episode is all about investing for education, perhaps for your kids. Education, some of the things that you need to consider and some of the avenues and strategies that might be available to you. It is good listening. You can find that wherever you listen to podcasts, and I'll put a link in today's show notes as well. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Michael.
It is Wednesday, the 6th of September, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.